On a snowy November night in Newtown, Connecticut, something vanished inside a quiet suburban home. Not money, not property, not a secret. A woman disappeared. Her name was Helle Crafts. There were no screams that night. No witnesses saw what happened inside the house. And when investigators began searching for her, they didn't find a body because someone believed they could erase her existence. They rented a wood chipper. They waited for the storm. And they tried to scatter every trace of her life into frozen silence. But they were wrong, because even when a body is destroyed, the truth can still be found in fragments. And the fragments were already waiting in the snow. The wind coming off the water cut through every layer of clothing the investigators wore that morning. It was winter along the banks of the Housatonic River, the ground frozen hard beneath a thin blanket of snow. The landscape looked quiet, almost peaceful, but the men and women scattered along the riverbank weren't there to admire the scenery. They were on their hands and knees, carefully searching the snow, not for something large, not for something obvious. They were searching for something so small that most people walking past would never even notice it. Every few minutes, someone would stop, lean closer to the ground, and brush aside a thin layer of frost with gloved fingers. Investigators weren't looking for a body. By that point, they already understood something deeply unsettling. There would never be one. The search team had been told to look for fragments. Tiny pieces, no bigger than pebbles. Bone, hair, anything that could prove a person had once been there. Hours passed in near silence as they combed the frozen debris along the river's edge, working inch by inch through a stretch of land that had been battered by snowstorms only weeks earlier. Then someone spotted something. At first, it didn't look like much, just a small object half buried in the icy ground. But when investigators carefully lifted it from the snow, the mood along the riverbank shifted. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't debris from the forest. It was human, a fragment of bone. And that discovery confirmed what investigators had slowly begun to suspect. The evidence they were gathering, scattered across miles of frozen ground, belonged to a woman named Helle Crafts, a mother, a flight attendant, a woman who had disappeared weeks earlier without a trace. Or at least, that's what someone had hoped. Because whoever was responsible for what happened to Helle had taken extraordinary steps to erase her from existence. The plan had been brutally simple. Destroy the body, scatter what remained, leave nothing behind that could ever be traced back to a crime. And for a while, it almost worked. But the people searching that riverbank weren't giving up. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, they were beginning to uncover a story someone believed would never be told. A story that would soon lead investigators to a quiet suburban home in Newtown, Connecticut, and to the man who thought he had committed the perfect crime. His name was Richard Crafts. And what investigators would eventually uncover will become one of the most disturbing and groundbreaking murder investigations in American history. Because in this case, there was nobody, only fragments. And those fragments were about to reveal the truth. Before there was an investigation, before detectives combed frozen riverbanks for fragments, there was simply a woman building a life. Her name was Helle Crafts. And long before her name would appear in court records and forensic reports, it belonged to a very different story, one that began thousands of miles away. Helle was born and raised in Denmark, in a country known for its quiet cities, strong communities, and a culture that valued independence and resilience. Friends later describe her as someone who carried those qualities naturally. She was disciplined, organized, and practical in the way many people become when they grow up learning to rely on themselves. But Helle was also curious about the world beyond the small boundaries of where she grew up. In the 1970s, international travel still carried a sense of excitement and prestige. Commercial aviation was expanding rapidly, and for many young people, working in the airline industry represented opportunity, adventure, and independence. Helle chose that path. She became a flight attendant with Pan American World Airways, one of the most recognized airlines in the world at the time. Working for Pan AM meant something. It meant professionalism, discipline, and constant movement between cities and continents. Flight attendants in those years weren't simply service staff. They were trained professionals responsible for safety, logistics, and the complex choreography of long international flights. For Helle, the job opened the door to a larger life. It allowed her to travel, to experience new cultures, and eventually, it brought her to the United States. Somewhere along those routes, somewhere between airports and layovers, Helle began building a new chapter of her life in America. It was here that she met Richard Crafts. Richard was also part of the aviation world. He worked as an airline pilot, a profession that carried its own sense of authority and prestige. Pilots were viewed as disciplined, highly trained professionals responsible for the safety of hundreds of passengers at a time. From the outside, it seemed like a natural match. Two people working in the same industry. Two professionals accustomed to travel, structure, and long hours. Their relationship developed quickly, and eventually they married. Together they settled in the quiet suburban community of Newtown, Connecticut, a town known for its tree-lined streets, well-kept homes, and the kind of neighborhoods where families built long, stable lives. It was the type of place where people knew their neighbors, where children rode bicycles down residential streets, where front lawns were carefully maintained and community life moved at a steady, predictable pace. For Helle, the move represented something many immigrants pursue when they come to the United States. Stability, a home, a family, a future. Over time, Helle and Richard had 3 children together. Balancing motherhood with the demanding schedule of an international flight attendant wasn't easy. The job required long stretches away from home, overnight flights, and unpredictable schedules. But those who knew Helle often described her as someone who managed her responsibilities with precision. She kept detailed records. She organized her finances. She planned. Friends later said she approached life almost the way a pilot approaches a flight plan. Carefully, methodically, making sure every detail was accounted for. She was devoted to her children and determined to build a secure life for them. Neighbors remembered seeing the family going about ordinary routines. Children leaving for school, weekend errands, the quiet rhythm of suburban family life. From the outside, the Crafts household looked exactly like what many people imagined when they thought of the American dream. A professional couple, 3 children, a comfortable home in a peaceful town. There was nothing about the family that suggested anything unusual. No public scandals. No dramatic scenes that neighbors could recall. Just a family living in a quiet Connecticut suburb. And if you had asked people in Newtown, Connecticut, during those years what they thought about the Crafts family, most likely they would have given a simple answer. They seemed normal, successful, even a pilot, a flight attendant, a house, children, a future that appeared stable and secure. But the truth about many tragedies is that they begin behind closed doors, far away from the view of neighbors or co-workers. And in the Crafts household, the life that appeared so orderly on the outside was already beginning to fracture. At first, the cracks were subtle. Quiet tensions, long absences, things that could easily be dismissed as the normal pressures of work, travel, and family life. But over time, those fractures would grow deeper, and the carefully constructed image of the perfect suburban family would begin to unravel, because the marriage between Helle Crafts and Richard Crafts was about to enter a period of conflict that would change everything. A conflict that Helle herself had already begun preparing for, and one that, before long, would lead investigators back to that quiet house in Newtown, Connecticut, searching for answers about a woman who had suddenly vanished. For a long time, the life inside the Crafts household followed the kind of routine many families know well. Flights are scheduled weeks in advance. Children heading off to school in the morning. 2 parents are balancing demanding careers in the airline industry. From the outside, nothing about the family living in Newtown, Connecticut, suggested anything unusual. But inside the marriage between Helle Crafts and Richard Crafts, something had begun to change. At first, the shift was subtle. Richard was often away for work, which wasn't unusual for a pilot. Long trips, overnight routes, and irregular schedules were part of the job. In aviation families, spouses often spent days apart, while flights carried them to different parts of the world. But over time, Helle began noticing details that didn't quite fit the normal rhythm of airline life. Phone calls that ended abruptly, trips that seemed to stretch longer than expected, small inconsistencies in Richard's explanations. For many people, suspicions like that might lead to arguments or emotional confrontations. But Helle approached the situation differently. Friends would later describe her as calm, methodical, and careful when it came to making decisions. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions or react impulsively. Instead, she began looking for answers. And eventually, Helle made a decision that would quietly change the direction of everything that followed. She hired a private investigator. It was not an emotional move. It was a calculated one. Helle wanted facts. The investigator began monitoring Richard's movements and looking into his activities outside of work. What he discovered confirmed the suspicions Helle had already begun to form. Richard was having an affair. The relationship wasn't casual or brief. Evidence showed that he had been involved with another woman for some time. For Helle, the discovery was painful, but it also provided clarity. Instead of trying to ignore what was happening, she began preparing for the next step. She gathered the information the investigator had collected. She organized documents. And she started thinking about how to move forward, not just for herself, but for her children. Eventually, Helle made her decision. She filed for divorce. For many couples, divorce is an emotional and complicated process. But in the Crafts household, the separation quickly turned into something far more tense. Because along with the divorce came another battle: custody. Helle was determined to protect her relationship with her 3 children. Friends later said she was deeply devoted to them and fiercely protective of their future. She wanted stability. She wanted to ensure that their lives would remain secure even as the marriage ended. But custody disputes can become some of the most emotionally charged conflicts in any divorce. And in the Crafts case, tensions began rising quickly. Lawyers became involved. Financial matters had to be sorted out. And both sides began preparing for what could become a difficult legal fight. Despite the stress of the situation, those close to Helle noticed something important about the way she handled it. She stayed organized. She stayed focused. She kept records. She documented conversations and financial details carefully, almost as if she understood that the coming months might require proof of everything. It was the same methodical mindset she had used throughout her life, approaching problems step by step, making sure she understood the facts before taking action. But as the conflict between Helle and Richard deepened, some of her friends began noticing something else: a growing sense of concern. Helle never described herself as frightened, but she did begin sharing thoughts with people she trusted. Quiet comments, observations about how tense the situation had become. And eventually, she said something that those friends would never forget. It wasn't said dramatically. There was no raised voice or sense of panic. Just a calm statement delivered with the same seriousness she used when discussing any other important matter. Helle told them that if anything ever happened to her, they should not accept a simple explanation. Her words were direct. "If anything ever happens to me, don't believe I left." At the time, some friends didn't fully understand why she said it. People sometimes make statements like that during difficult divorces, especially when emotions are running high. But the way Helle said it stayed with them. It wasn't spoken like a threat. It sounded more like a warning. And months later, when Helle Crafts suddenly vanished without explanation, those words would echo in the minds of the people who had heard them. Because the moment she disappeared, one question would begin to trouble everyone who knew her. What if that warning had been more than just a passing remark? What if Helle had already sensed that something far more dangerous was unfolding behind the closed doors of that quiet house in Newtown, Connecticut? And if she had, then the story of her disappearance was about to become far darker than anyone had imagined. November in Connecticut has a way of turning quiet towns into still, gray landscapes. By mid-November, the bright colors of autumn are gone. The trees stand bare. The air carries a sharp cold that settles into the ground and stays there. Streets empty earlier in the evening, and most people retreat indoors long before night fully settles in. On November 18th, 1986, that quiet atmosphere was interrupted by a winter storm moving through the region. Snow began falling steadily across the town of Newtown, Connecticut. At first it was light, just a thin dusting that softened the sidewalks and rooftops. But as the evening went on, the snowfall intensified. Roads became slick. Visibility dropped. The kind of weather where people prefer to stay home if they could. But that evening, Helle Crafts was finishing a work shift. Like many nights in her life, the day had been spent traveling. Working as a flight attendant for Pan American World Airways meant irregular schedules and long hours. Still, Helle handled the demands of the job with the same careful organization she applied to the rest of her life. When her shift ended, a co-worker offered her a ride home. It was a small, ordinary gesture, the kind co-workers make without thinking twice about it, especially on a snowy night when driving conditions are getting worse. They drove through quiet streets of Newtown together, headlights cutting through the falling snow. The town was already beginning to settle down for the evening. Houses glowed warmly behind curtains. Most people had already gone inside. Eventually, the car pulled up in front of Helle's home. Her co-worker watched as she stepped out of the car and walked up the short path toward the front door. Snow crunched softly beneath her feet. The storm had grown heavier now. The flakes thicker, the air colder. It was the kind of moment that seemed completely ordinary. A woman arriving home after work. A wave goodbye. A car pulls away down a quiet street. But that moment would later become one of the most important details in the entire investigation, because it was the last confirmed time anyone outside that house ever saw Helle Crafts alive. The co-worker drove away into the snowstorm. Behind her, Helle approached the front door of the home she shared with her husband, Richard Crafts, and their 3 children. The porch light illuminated the falling snow. Then she stepped inside. The storm continued through the night. Snow accumulated on rooftops, on lawns, and along the quiet suburban streets. The world outside slowly disappeared beneath a growing blanket of white. By midnight, the town had fallen almost completely silent. What happened inside the house during those hours has never been witnessed by anyone who has come forward. No neighbors reported hearing anything unusual. No one saw anyone leave. No one saw anyone arrive. And yet, by morning, something was terribly wrong. Because when the sun rose over Newtown the next day, Helle Crafts was gone. No phone calls. No messages. No sign she had gone anywhere voluntarily. Just a silent house. And a storm that had covered everything in snow. For investigators who would later study the timeline of that night, the weather mattered. The snowstorm had changed the landscape completely. Footprints could disappear within minutes. Evidence left outdoors could be buried quickly beneath fresh snow. And the quiet streets meant there were almost no witnesses. It was the kind of night where something could happen and the world outside might never notice. Somewhere between the moment Helle walked through that front door and the morning that followed, her life ended. But the truth about what happened inside the house would take investigators months and an extraordinary search to uncover, because whoever was responsible believed the storm had helped them hide everything. For a time, it seemed like they were right. At first, nothing seemed obviously wrong. But when investigators later began piecing together the events of that night, Richard's behavior would raise one troubling question after another. In the early hours of the morning, long before the sun came up, Richard suddenly removed the children from the house. Neighbors would later remember seeing unusual activity while most of the neighborhood was still asleep. It was the middle of winter, and the snowstorm from the night before still blanketed the streets. Richard claimed there was a problem with the home's heating system. He said the furnace wasn't working properly and that it was too cold for the children to stay inside. So he packed them up and left the house before sunrise. At the time, it sounded like a reasonable explanation. Winter in Connecticut could be brutal, and a broken heating system would certainly be a concern for any parent. But as investigators looked closer, that explanation began to fall apart. When authorities later examined the house, they found no evidence of any serious heating malfunction. The furnace appeared to be functioning normally. There was no emergency, no urgent reason to rush the children out of the house before dawn. And that detail will begin to stand out, because if there was no heating crisis, why leave so suddenly? Even more troubling was Richard's demeanor in the days that followed. A husband whose wife had just disappeared might be frantic, desperate, calling friends, searching for answers. But Richard appeared oddly calm. Instead of urgently searching for Helle, He began offering explanations about why she might be gone. At first, he told people that Helle had simply gone to Denmark. She was Danish, after all. Perhaps she needed time with her family. But when investigators checked airline records, they found no evidence that she had boarded any flight. No ticket, no reservation, no passport activity. So the story changed. Richard then suggested that Helle had simply gone on a vacation. Maybe she just needed some time away from everything. The divorce, the tension at home. But once again, the explanation didn't hold up. Helle had left behind her luggage. Her personal belongings were still in the house. And perhaps most telling of all, she had made no arrangements for her children, for a mother who had always been deeply involved in her kids' lives. That detail struck investigators as particularly strange. Then came yet another version of the story. Richard began telling people that Helle simply needed space, that she had chosen to leave on her own. Maybe she would return when things cooled down. But as investigators and friends examined these explanations, a pattern began to emerge. Each new story seemed to replace the one before it. Denmark, a vacation. Time away. None of them matched the evidence. None of them matched Helle's personality. And none of them answered the question everyone was beginning to ask. If Helle had truly left voluntarily, why had no one heard from her? Days turned into weeks. And with every passing day, the inconsistency surrounding Richard's story became harder to ignore. Behind the calm explanations, something didn't feel right. And soon, investigators would uncover something far more disturbing, hidden in the snow that would transform this missing person case into one of the most shocking murder investigations in American history. In missing person investigations, silence is often the greatest danger. Not the silence of the victim, but the silence of the world around them. In the days after Helle Crafts disappeared, one thing became clear to the people who knew her. Helle was not the type of person who would simply vanish without explanation. Friends remembered her as organized, thoughtful, and deeply committed to her children. She was a mother who planned carefully for the future. She kept records. She thought ahead. And perhaps most importantly, she trusted the people close to her enough to speak openly about her fears. Months before she disappeared, Helle had told several friends something they would later replay in their minds again and again. It was never said in a dramatic moment. There was no emotional breakdown or panic, just a quiet, serious warning. If anything happened to her, they should not believe she left voluntarily. If something ever happens to me, don't believe I left. Those words were not spoken as a threat. They were spoken as preparation. At the time, some friends felt uneasy hearing it. People sometimes say such things during stressful divorces, especially when relationships are breaking apart. But Helle's friends knew her personality. She was methodical, careful, logical in the way she handled problems. The warning felt less like fear and more like someone trying to leave behind guidance in case the worst happened. And when Helle suddenly disappeared after the night of November 18th, 1986, those words returned to them with frightening clarity, because the official explanations they were hearing did not match the woman they knew. They began making calls, first to the local authorities in Newtown, Connecticut, then to the investigators. Then again, and again, they refused to accept the idea that Helle had simply walked away from her children, her work, and her life without a word, without taking her belongings, without contacting anyone. The persistence of Helle's friends became one of the most important factors in the entire investigation. At first, the case was treated like a missing person report. But as the friends continued pushing, investigators started looking more carefully at the household, the timeline, and the behavior of Richard Crafts. It was not immediate. Missing person cases are often slow to move, especially when there is no physical evidence of crime. But the pressure from Helle's social circle kept the case alive. They spoke to authorities repeatedly. They shared what Helle had told them about her marriage. They described the divorce proceedings that were underway. They explained that Helle was fighting for custody of her children and was planning her future carefully. The more investigators listened to those who knew Helle personally, the more one conclusion began to form. The woman they were describing did not behave like someone who would abandon her life voluntarily. She was preparing to leave her marriage, not her children, not her future, not her responsibilities. For investigators, this became a critical psychological detail, because sometimes the strongest evidence in a missing person case is not what is found, but what is missing from behavior of the person who supposedly disappeared. There were no signs that Helle had withdrawn money and fled. No travel records. No messages left behind. No attempt to contact family or close friends. Just silence. And that silence, combined with the warning she had given earlier, made her friends even more determined. They refused to let the case disappear into routine administrative processing. They continued calling, continued asking questions, continued pushing investigators to treat the disappearance as something more serious than an unexplained absence. Looking back, investigators would later say that without the persistence of Helle's friends, the case might have followed a very different path, because at that moment, there was still no confirmed evidence of murder, only suspicion, and suspicion alone is rarely enough to drive a full criminal investigation. But Helle's friends had already made one decision. They would not stay quiet, even if the authorities were uncertain, even if there were no answers yet. They would keep speaking, because they believed deep inside that Helle had tried to make sure someone would be listening if she ever stopped speaking for herself. And while investigators began expanding their search, the story was slowly moving towards something far darker, toward the place where suspicion would turn into theory, and theory would eventually become forensic proof. At first, the disappearance of Helle Crafts was handled as a missing person case. There was nobody there, no direct witness testimony, no confirmed crime scene, only concern from friends and family. But as investigators in Newtown, Connecticut, began examining the circumstances more closely, small inconsistencies started forming a pattern. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediately conclusive, but disturbing nonetheless. The first breakthrough came from financial and purchase records. Authorities discovered that Richard Crafts had rented equipment in the days surrounding Helle's disappearance. Two particular items drew investigators' attention: a wood chipper and a chainsaw. At the time, the significance of these rentals was not immediately obvious to everyone outside the investigation team, but experienced homicide investigators understood why those details mattered. Both tools are capable of breaking down biological material. Both could be used to destroy evidence. Neither is something most people would rent under ordinary circumstances. Investigators began tracing the rental history of the equipment. They wanted to know when the tools were obtained, how long they were kept, and where they were returned. The timeline that emerged was unsettling. The equipment had been rented during the period surrounding the storm that had moved through Connecticut on the night of November 18, 1986. Another detail soon emerged. Snowplow operators who worked in the region reported seeing unusual activity during the early morning hours following the storm. Several drivers remembered passing through remote areas near the Housatonic River and Lake Zor. One report described a vehicle parked in a location that would normally be empty at that time of morning. Another driver recalled seeing movement near the roadside, though visibility was poor because of continuing snowfall. None of these sightings alone proved anything, but together they created a troubling possibility. Investigators began focusing their search around the riverbank areas near the Housatonic River and the surrounding terrain close to Lake Zor. The geography of the region mattered. Riverbanks can carry evidence downstream. Cold water slows decomposition. Snow can conceal traces of activity. If someone had attempted to destroy a body using mechanical equipment, this location would provide several advantages for hiding evidence. Search teams were deployed. The work was painstaking. Investigators sifted through snow, soil, and riverbank sediment. They worked slowly, understanding that the evidence they were searching for might be extremely small. Because if the prosecution's theory were correct, there would be no intact remains, only fragments. Hair, bone, tissue, perhaps personal items that could be traced back to the victim. Hours turned into days. Then something began to appear. First, investigators found strands of hair embedded in frozen soil. Then, tiny biological fragments. Over time, more material was recovered. The quantity was small, far smaller than what would normally be associated with a body, but forensic experts believed the pattern itself was important. The distribution suggested that biological material had been deliberately dispersed rather than accidentally deposited. One of the most significant discoveries was a fragment of bone. The fragment was sent to forensic specialists for comparison. Dental records from Helle Crafts' lifetime were obtained. Investigators compared microscopic structural details of the bone fragment with X-ray dental records that had been taken while she was alive. The match was confirmed. This was a turning point, because it meant something legally and scientifically important. The case was no longer treated as a missing person investigation. It was now a homicide investigation. The prosecution would later argue that the destruction of the body had been so deliberate that it represented an attempt to eliminate physical proof of murder. But science was beginning to push back against that assumption. Forensic technology, careful microscopic analysis, and patient reconstruction were allowing investigators to prove identity even when remains were almost destroyed. As the search continued, additional personal traces were recovered: hair samples, tissue fragments, items that could be directly associated with Helle. Each discovery strengthened the theory that violence had occurred inside the Crafts household. Meanwhile, investigators continued analyzing Richard's behavior and financial records. The purchase and rental history of the chainsaw and wood chipper became critical pieces of evidence. The prosecution would later argue that these tools were not chosen randomly. They were consistent with an attempt to mechanically dismantle a body to make identification impossible. By the time the investigation expanded fully, what had begun as a missing person case had transformed into one of the most methodical forensic searches in Connecticut history. The riverbank along the Housatonic became more than a search location. It became the silent witness to what investigators believed had happened. And with every fragment recovered, the story of Helle Crafts began to reemerge from the snow, the soil, and the cold water that someone once believed would hide her forever. But the investigation was far from over, because the most difficult challenge was still ahead: proving in court that a murder had occurred, even though there was no traditional body to present to a jury. And that would lead investigators toward a trial that would later redefine how justice could be pursued in cases where a victim's remains had been deliberately destroyed. The investigation of Helle Crafts reached its most critical phase when search teams intensified their work along the frozen landscape near the Housatonic River. By this point, investigators were no longer expecting to find a complete body. They were searching for what remained after extreme destruction. The working theory of prosecutors was disturbing but scientifically grounded. They believed someone had attempted to destroy Helle's body using mechanical equipment after her death. The goal, according to investigators, was simple: eliminate physical evidence that could be used to prove homicide. The search operation was conducted with extraordinary patience. Teams sifted through snow, riverbank soil, and sediment layer by layer. This was not a dramatic search with large discoveries. It was slow, almost clinical work, because the evidence investigators were looking for might be smaller than a fingernail. Then the first breakthrough came. Hair fragments were recovered. Not a single strand, but multiple microscopic samples embedded in frozen earth and debris. Hair evidence alone cannot usually confirm identity, but it can provide a biological context when compared with known samples. The fragments were preserved and sent for forensic laboratory analysis. Soon after, additional biological traces were found: tiny pieces of human tissue, bone fragments smaller than what most people would associate with a recognizable body. Each sample was carefully cataloged. Each sample was treated as potential evidence in a homicide prosecution. But the most important discovery was still ahead. The moment investigators found it, they understood its significance immediately: a tooth fragment. In forensic homicide investigations, dental evidence is often considered one of the most reliable forms of identification because teeth are highly resistant to decomposition, fire, and mechanical damage. The fragment was transported under strict chain-of-custody procedures to forensic specialists. Forensic dentists then began the microscopic comparison process. The method used was not based on general appearance. Instead, specialists compared structural patterns inside the tooth fragment with dental X-ray records that had been taken during Helle's lifetime. These records existed because she had received dental treatment before her disappearance. Using magnification and forensic imaging, experts examined root structure, internal density patterns, morphological alignment, minute structural markers unique to individual dental anatomy. The comparison was conducted point by point. The result was scientifically decisive. The tooth fragment matched the dental records of Helle Crafts. This confirmation was crucial because it established, beyond a reasonable forensic doubt, that the biological remains recovered from the search area belonged to Helle. In legal terms, the case crossed an important threshold. A missing person case became a confirmed homicide investigation. Prosecutors now had a named victim. And in homicide law, identifying a victim is one of the foundational requirements for establishing a murder charge. The forensic findings did more than identify remains. They reconstructed the reality of what had happened. The pattern of evidence suggested violent destruction of a human body. Hair fragments, tissue traces, and bone pieces were consistent with mechanical dismemberment rather than natural decomposition. Investigators also reinforced earlier findings regarding equipment purchases and rentals connected to Richard Crafts. The prosecution would later argue that the combination of forensic evidence and behavioral evidence demonstrated intentional homicide, followed by systematic body destruction. What made this breakthrough particularly significant was its legal and scientific impact. At the time, many criminal cases depended heavily on eyewitness testimony or recovery of intact remains. The Crafts investigation demonstrated something revolutionary for forensic science and criminal prosecution. A body does not have to be recovered in complete form to prove murder. Even fragmentary biological evidence, when analyzed with scientific rigor, can establish identity and support homicide charges. The case would later become a teaching example in forensic science and legal education, because it showed that extreme attempts to destroy a victim's body do not necessarily destroy the truth of the crime. For investigators working the case, the breakthrough was deeply emotional. Every fragment recovered represented more than scientific data. It represented a life that someone had tried to erase. Helle Crafts was not found in the way most victims are recovered. She was found in the only way still possible, through microscopic evidence carried by cold river water, frozen soil, and patient forensic reconstruction. And with that discovery, the investigation moved into its final and most legally consequential stage. The prosecution now had what it needed to bring murder charges. But the courtroom battle that followed would test whether circumstantial forensic evidence alone could sustain a conviction in one of the most controversial homicide cases of the era, because the defense would soon argue something very different, and the jury would have to decide whether fragments were enough to prove that a life had been taken. The criminal trial of Richard Crafts would later be remembered not only as a murder prosecution, but also as a turning point in how modern courts evaluate forensic science. The legal significance of the case extended far beyond the personal tragedy of Helle Crafts. At its core, the prosecution faced a challenge that had historically made many homicide cases extremely difficult. They had to prove that a murder had occurred even though there was no intact body to present in court. Traditionally, criminal justice systems place strong evidentiary weight on physical remains. Without a body, defense attorneys often argued that it was impossible to establish death beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense strategy in the Crafts trial followed that historical line of reasoning. The argument was simple in concept, but powerful in courtroom psychology. Helle might have left voluntarily. She might have traveled to Europe. She might have decided to start a new life. The absence of a body, according to the defense, created reasonable uncertainty. Prosecutors were therefore forced to build their case using behavioral evidence, circumstantial patterns, and forensic reconstruction. The prosecution presented a carefully structured narrative. First, they demonstrated the documented marital conflict between Helle and her husband. Evidence showed she had discovered the affair involving Richard Crafts. She had hired a private investigator and initiated divorce proceedings. Witnesses testified that Helle had told trusted friends that if something happened to her, they should not believe she had left voluntarily. This statement became psychologically important in the trial, not as proof of murder by itself, but as context for her state of mind and intentions. Next, prosecutors presented forensic findings. Search operations near the Housatonic River recovered microscopic biological material. Experts testified about the recovery of hair fragments, tissue traces, and bone fragments. The most critical evidence was the tooth fragment. Forensic odontologists compared the fragment with dental x-ray records from Helle's medical history. The microscopic structural alignment was presented to the jury. The conclusion was stated clearly. The fragment was consistent with the dental anatomy of Helle Crafts. While defense attorneys attempted to challenge the reliability of fragmentary identification, prosecution experts argued that dental structures are among the most scientifically stable biological identifiers. The prosecution also reconstructed the timeline surrounding November 18th to 19th, 1986. Witness testimony established that Helle was last seen when a co-worker dropped her off at her home in Newtown, Connecticut during the snowstorm. Investigators then presented evidence of equipment rentals, including a wood chipper and chainsaw, which were connected to Richard Crafts through purchase and rental records. The prosecution argued that the combination of behavioral evidence, mechanical tool access, and forensic fragments supported the conclusion that homicide had occurred followed by deliberate body destruction. One of the most important legal questions in the trial was whether circumstantial evidence alone could sustain a murder conviction. The defense maintained that without a body, death itself could not be proven definitively. Prosecutors countered that criminal law does not require eyewitness testimony or intact remains if the totality of evidence establishes guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The jury was asked to consider whether it was reasonable to believe that Helle would voluntarily abandon her children, her legal proceedings, and her established life without contact. After presentation of evidence and arguments, the jury reached a verdict. Richard Crafts was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to a prison term of 50 years. The conviction was later reviewed by the Connecticut Supreme Court, which upheld the verdict. The court's ruling became historically important because it affirmed that circumstantial evidence, when sufficiently comprehensive and scientifically supported, can sustain a homicide conviction even in the absence of a recovered body. The case became one of the earliest and most influential successful nobody homicide prosecutions in the United States. For forensic science, the trial represented a shift in investigative philosophy. It demonstrated that attempts to completely destroy a victim's remains do not necessarily eliminate the possibility of legal accountability. For criminal justice education, the Crafts case became a reference point in teaching how modern investigations combine psychology, behavior analysis, and microscopic forensic science. The trial did more than convict a man. It transformed expectations about what could be proven in court, and it gave legal meaning to something investigators had already begun to understand. Destroying a body does not automatically destroy the truth of a crime. The smallest fragments can still carry the story of what happened. And in the case of Helle Crafts, those fragments were enough to speak for her. But even after conviction, the case would leave behind deeper questions about violence inside ordinary lives, and about how much warning a person can truly have before tragedy strikes. Because Helle's warning to her friends had been simple. If something happens to me, don't believe I left. And in the end, that warning became one of the most haunting details of the entire investigation. Long after the trial ended, the story of Helle Crafts remained about something far larger than courtroom arguments or forensic technique. It was about warning signs, about trust, and about the quiet strength of a woman who sensed danger before anyone else did. Helle Crafts did not live her final years believing she was completely safe. She understood that her marriage to Richard Crafts was breaking apart. She saw the affair. She took legal steps. She hired investigators. And most hauntingly, she spoke to the people closest to her. If anything happened to her, they should not believe she left voluntarily. That warning did not sound dramatic at the time. It was spoken calmly, almost matter-of-factly. But those words carried enormous weight once she disappeared. Because when Helle vanished on that snowy night in Newtown, Connecticut, her friends remembered exactly what she had said, and they acted. They contacted authorities. They refused to accept simple explanations. They kept asking questions. In many investigations, justice depends not only on scientific technology or legal strategy. It also depends on human persistence. People who are willing to speak when something feels wrong. People who refuse to let silence become the final answer. The search along the Housatonic River would eventually recover microscopic fragments of Helle's existence. Hair, tissue, and a tooth fragment that forensic experts matched to dental records from her lifetime. Those fragments were not large. They were not the kind of remains most people imagine when they think of solving a murder, but they were enough to identify her, enough to prove she had been killed, and enough to bring a conviction. The case became a milestone in forensic history because it demonstrated something deeply important. Violence can destroy a body, but it does not necessarily erase the truth of what happened. The conviction in the wood chipper murder case reshaped how investigators and courts viewed circumstantial evidence. It showed that science, patient, and careful reconstruction can reveal crimes that were once believed impossible to prove. More quietly, the story also became a reminder of something deeply human. Helle was not remembered only as a victim. She was remembered as a mother, as an immigrant who built a life across oceans, as a woman who tried to prepare the people she loved for danger she could not fully prevent. In the end, the most haunting part of the story was not the violence itself. It was the warning she gave before it happened. Because Helle Crafts knew something was wrong long before anyone else did, and she tried to make sure someone would listen if she was no longer able to speak. The people who loved her did listen, and because they did, the truth was not lost. Even when someone tries to erase every trace of a life, the smallest fragments can still speak. And sometimes, those fragments are enough to bring justice back from silence. Behind every criminal case that captures public attention, there is a family left carrying the emotional weight of what happened. In the story of Helle Crafts, the tragedy did not end with the conviction of Richard Crafts. The legal outcome closed one chapter of the investigation, but for Helle's children and extended family, the emotional consequences continued far beyond the courtroom. Helle was the mother of 3 children. Public records and reporting indicate that they were young at the time of her disappearance in 1986. Like many children involved in violent crime cases, they were suddenly forced into a reality they did not fully understand. One of the most devastating aspects of the situation was the uncertainty. Unlike cases where a body is recovered and a funeral could provide some form of closure, the destruction of Helle's remains meant the family could not experience traditional mourning rituals. There was no grave to visit, no physical place where the children could stand and remember their mother. Psychologists who study trauma in families affected by homicide often note that unresolved physical absence can intensify grief because the human mind struggles to process loss without tangible confirmation. The children were also caught between 2 painful realities. On one side was a memory of their mother, someone described by friends as organized, caring, and deeply devoted to her family. On the other side was the criminal conviction of their father. The legal proceedings established that Helle had been murdered, but the emotional complexity for the children was far more difficult than the legal verdict itself. Children of homicide victims often experience what trauma specialists call ambiguous family identity conflict. They are forced to process grief while navigating complicated feelings toward the surviving parent. In this case, that conflict was especially intense because the convicted individual was their father. Long-term psychological effects associated with childhood exposure to parental homicide can include trust difficulties, anxiety patterns, and emotional distancing as a protective coping mechanism. The community of Newtown, Connecticut, also played a role in the children's environment after the disappearance. Small communities often respond strongly to violent crime, offering social support networks, but they can also unintentionally increase emotional pressure on affected families through public attention and discussion. Family members of Helle worked to provide stability for the children after the legal proceedings. Maintaining education, normal routines, and social continuity is often considered important in trauma recovery for children who have experienced parental loss through violence. Psychologists emphasize that children in such situations benefit from environments that avoid forcing them to make public statements about their experiences before they are emotionally ready. One of the most heartbreaking realities of the case is that the children lost not only a mother, but also the possibility of a future relationship with her. Helle's disappearance occurred during a period when she was actively planning her next steps in life, including divorce proceedings and custody considerations. Friends later reported that she was deeply concerned about her children's well-being. That concern was reflected in the warning she gave to trusted friends. "If anything happens to me, don't believe I left." Those words were ultimately remembered as an expression of maternal protection. Helle was attempting, in her own way, to create a safety signal for the people around her in case something happened. For the children, the case became part of their life narrative whether they wanted it or not. Growing up after such an event often requires learning how to carry memory, loss, and identity at the same time. Trauma research suggests that children who lose a parent to violent crime may experience periods of emotional numbness, followed by waves of grief triggered by life milestones, such as graduation, marriage, or parenthood. The Crafts children's lives were largely kept out of public discussion to protect their privacy, and that privacy itself became part of the family's healing process. Public attention in violent crime cases can sometimes create secondary trauma, so limiting exposure is often considered beneficial for long-term emotional recovery. The story of Helle Crafts ultimately remains centered on more than criminal justice. It is also the story of a mother who tried to build a safe future for her children, a network of friends who refused to stay silent, and a community and legal system that eventually worked to uncover the truth. Even though the crime attempted to erase physical traces of her existence, the emotional and historical memory of her life endured. And for her children, the greatest legacy was not the violence that took her away, but the knowledge that their mother fought to make sure someone would keep looking if she ever disappeared. Because in the end, Helle Crafts was not only a victim of a crime. She was a mother who tried to protect her children even from beyond the moment she feared most. And her story continues to remind people that even when violence attempts to erase a life, the fragments that remain of evidence, of memory, and of love can still carry a voice forward.